Okay, let me just give a brief intro as to what we're doing this morning and why we're doing it. For the past 2 years, we've been hosted by the Hillel building, the Bronfman Center, which is the Hillel at NYU, which is a lovely space. We were very sorry not to have it this year, both because it's a lovely space and we missed the physical Beit Midrash. But as we were preparing for the summer, before we knew that everything was going to be virtual, I said to myself, wait a second, we've been at NYU for 2 years and I haven't asked Professor Rubenstein to speak. What was I thinking? So needless to say, this year we have Professor Rubenstein, but not NYU. Professor Jeffrey Rubenstein is a very prominent scholar in the field of aggada. The main focus of his research is the genre of aggada, and actually many different kinds of aggadot that appear both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. He's published a number of works, some of which are more accessible to a popular audience, some of which are more scholarly. On a personal level, Professor Rubenstein happens to be a family friend, and as somebody that I've looked up to for a long time, as somebody who manages, first of all, to be a pioneer in a field of Talmud that is not widely appreciated. I think people don't have a sense that you can learn Aggada both as a serious scholarly subject, but also that Aggada is something that you can learn just as seriously in a Beit Midrash setting as a halachic sugya. And what I asked Professor Rubenstein to do this morning is give us an example of that, to show us an example of how an aggadic sugya can be learned seriously and can be mined for the same kinds of things that we look for in halachic sugyot, in terms of what were Chazal trying to get at when they crafted a particular sugya. How do these ideas filter down through later periods in halachic history and Jewish history? Professor Rubenstein has also been a model for me in terms of somebody who's managed to make Talmud scholarship accessible not only to a scholarly audience, but also, as I said, to a popular audience. He's a very engaging speaker, and I hope his talk will be as enlightening for you as his talks have been for me over the years.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jeff Rubenstein, and I teach at NYU. Most of my work has been on Talmudic stories, at least most of my recent work, and I'm still working on that. So I wanted to do a session on Talmudic stories, and especially on a particular type of grouping of stories, I guess, which is a collection of stories that you find in the Talmud. As you probably know, there are hundreds, maybe up to 1,000. I don't think anybody's counted stories in the Babylonian Talmud alone, not to mention the Yerushalmi books of Midrash. But most of these stories appear, as you might say, solitary. That is, they're integrated in the legal discussion. They're integrated into a unit of Midrash, that is, biblical exegesis. And then you'll get a story, sometimes one or two, but and they're there for various purposes. However, there are sometimes in the Talmud and also in Midrash, just about in every rabbinic compilation, groupings of stories, which we call story cycles or story collections, which means you have 3 or more stories in rapid succession with no interruptions between them, or maybe just a little bit of connecting words like you have in our example. And sometimes these can be quite vast. I mean, you have some, if you're familiar, in Tanit, the stories about fasting and rain, or in Gittin, stories of destruction, where you have close to 20, 30, even up to 40 stories. So there are about 25 to 30 of these story cycles in the Bavli, but they contain, if you count up all the stories, over 400 stories. So on the one hand, 25 to 30 is not that much, maybe another 15 or 20 in other rabbinic works, but 400 stories is considerable. So I think it's an important phenomenon to research and think about why you have these sustained collections of narratives. one thing I think the stories do, and that's what I want to really focus on this time, so here's sort of the leading question to think about as we go through it, is at least some of these units try to explore an issue in what we might call a quasi-philosophical way. And I say quasi-philosophical because it's certainly not philosophical in the same way that the Greeks might write philosophy about a given topic. But I think what the series of stories is trying to do is accomplish that same thing. That is what a philosophical essay might do, which is to examine different aspects of a story, different dimensions, by thinking about variations, by trying to get at more abstract questions through comparisons and contrasts and juxtapositions of narrative material. So the rabbis were not philosophers. They did not write philosophy, but I think they were trying to do essentially the similar thing, through this kind of narrative mechanism of a story cycle. Okay, so keep that in mind, as we go through it, and we'll come back at the end to try to really address that. The story cycle we're looking at here, as you know, is about astrology, and it contains this phrase "Ein Mazal Yisrael," which is very famous, sometimes misunderstood and mistranslated. I think, as you saw from the stories themselves, Ein Mazal Yisrael does not mean there's no astrology for Jews, or astrology does not affect Jews at all. Essentially, what Ein Mazal Yisrael means is, although astrology affects Jews, it can be superseded or overcome in certain ways by mitzvot, especially. And it's important to realize this because I think we sometimes are under the misunderstanding that we don't believe in astrology. Jews don't believe in astrology. We believe in reward and punishment. We believe in doing mitzvot, and that's the basis for our fate. And maybe that's true today, but astrology has had a tremendous influence on Judaism from the rabbinic period through the Middle Ages, really till the modern period. And for obvious reasons. But just to see the influence, you can think of our phrase Mazel Tov. What does Mazel Tov literally mean? Right? It means, right, good luck or congratulations. But what is Mazal and Mazel Tov? Mazal is?
Constellation.
Yeah, a constellation, a celestial body, as in Akub, of Dei Kochavim Umazalot, a worshiper of stars and constellations, a Gentile. So when we say Mazel Tov, we're really using an astrological term to say somebody, to say someone, I hope your fortune is good. I hope you're under a good constellation or celestial influence at this point. The reason why astrology had such an important influence, such a prominent influence, is because in antiquity, and really until the modern period, there was no distinction between astrology and astronomy. We make that distinction today, but until the Enlightenment, really, astrology was astronomy, it was science. So, and I mean, as you know, so many people still believe in astrology today. They don't even make that distinction. So it's very hard for the rabbis to reject astrology. It would be like us rejecting cosmology or modern astronomy. We're saying something like, we don't believe the sun is the center of the solar system. For whatever reason, So the rabbis couldn't really reject astrology outright any more than we would want to reject, say, modern medicine outright, even though, we might say, well, our fate doesn't depend on doctors and viruses and COVID. It depends on prayer. It's very hard to say. So the rabbis were stuck, right? On the one hand, they wanted to believe in traditional biblical and rabbinic, ideas, which did not involve fatalism. Clearly, there's tshuva and there's schar ve'onesh, reward and punishment, and so on. But on the other hand, here the science is telling you celestial bodies influence your fate. So Ein Mazal Yisrael, you see, is a kind of way of trying to finesse that or really negotiate that tension. On the one hand, we respect astrology. It does influence fate. On the other hand, it's not the whole picture. But again, keep this in mind as we read through the story. And in fact, I don't know how much of the Talmudic sugya you got to, but in the previous section of Talmud, there is actually the opinion Yesh Mazal Yisrael, which certain rabbis advocate. In fact, this whole sugya is kind of debating whether there is a Mazal Yisrael or there is not a Mazal Yisrael. And Yesh Mazal Yisrael basically means, you know, fate does impact the Jews totally, you know, apparently, or celestial influences cannot be overcome. Yeah, am I taking questions at the end? Yeah, if anybody has a question, please jump in at any point. That's a good question. We will have time for questions at the end. But yeah, if I say something you don't understand, or if I use a term, you know, please don't hesitate just to jump in. So anyway, this is why you can see the rabbis grappling with astrology, and why these stories, I think, are something that we have to take seriously in terms of their engagement with astrology and their belief in astrological influences, celestial influences. Okay, so that's all just by way of introduction to this, and what we're going to try to do. Yeah, question.
Ask a quick question. Yeah, is astrologer at this time, is that always going to be non-Jewish?
Is an astrologer always going to be non-Jewish? That's a good question. I mean, usually the astrologers are just Chaldai, you know, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I don't recall seeing Jewish astrologers in the Talmud, but some rabbis, even in this sugya, do advocate astrological positions and systems. So whether they were astrologers themselves or just, you know, buying into astrology and had access to astrological traditions, you know, they definitely were believers, let's say. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good question. That's a good question. In the Middle Ages, a lot of rabbis, you know, from Ibn Ezra, all of them dabbled in astrology, and, you know, so. Yeah, Chaldean does imply Babylonian, but Chaldean becomes a technical term in the Talmud for astrologer. So it loses its sense of, you know, Chaldean as a Chaldai, as a city. Astrology originated in Babylonia or Chaldea, although by the time of the rabbis, it had gotten revamped through a Hellenistic system that sort of, you know, revised and augmented the original astrology that might have been Babylonian or Chaldean. Okay, so let's look at our text. So I know you've prepared these, so we'll just go through them briefly. What I want to do is, you know, again, go through each story, talk about the story individually, but as we're going through them, I want you to keep in mind whether you're noticing contrasts and connections between the stories. Okay, that's what we're going to take up at the end. All right, so. Okay, so let's read through these. I'll read them in Hebrew, but, you know, or the Aramaic, okay, but you have the translation there. Okay, so Uda Shmuel Nami Ein Mazal Yisrael. So the first story starts that Shmuel also holds the system, right? Astrology does not affect Jews, or astrology is not the whole story. De Shmuel ve'Avlat ki havu yatve ve'azle hanach inshi liadma. So Shmuel and Avlat, while they were sitting, certain men were going out to the field or out to the marsh. Now, this Avlat, if you notice, Rashi says a Persian sage or a Gentile sage, something like that. He's actually mentioned in 2 or 3 or 4 other Talmudic passages, debating with Shmuel or having some interaction with Shmuel. So he's kind of a known figure. Here he clearly is represented as, you know, I think the counterpart to Shmuel in terms of putting forward Gentile wisdom or secular wisdom, you might say, or Persian wisdom. So they're sitting there, they see some men going out to the marsh or to the field. Amar le Avlat le Shmuel, Hai Gavra Azel Veloati. So Avlat says to Shmuel, this man will go but not come back. Vetarik le Chivya umait. A snake will bite him and he will die. Now, how does Avlat know this? Because he's an astrologer, okay? I mean, clearly, you know, this is, we don't know this explicitly from this one line, but based on how the story is introduced, this must be the case. So Avlat says to Shmuel, look, I just saw this guy's horoscope. I just read his destiny in the stars, and he's going to die this day. Amar le Shmuel azel ve'ati. So Shmuel says he will go and return. Now, the source of Shmuel's knowledge here, or confidence, is not totally clear, I think. Shmuel is clearly rejecting this kind of astral fatalism. Rashi says something like he could pray or do tshuva and change his fate. But in any case, this beginning, you can see, sets up a very stark contrast. Shmuel versus Avlat, Jewish sage versus Persian or Gentile sage. You know, Jewish system, you might say, or Jewish wisdom versus Gentile wisdom. Who is right, who is wrong? Will this man go and come back or not? Adiyatve ka'aske be azel ve'ata. So while Shmuel and Avlat are still sitting and talking about it, you know, he went and came back. So obviously Shmuel was right and Avlat was wrong. But what happens? Avlat, kam Avlat shadye letune ashkach be chivya de pasek v'shadi betarte gubai. So Avlat got up, threw off the man's pack, his backpack, or his load, literally, load of wood, a bundle of wood and tools and clothes, whatever he had. And he found there a snake that was cut and thrown into two pieces. Right? So Avlat knew what he saw in the stars. He couldn't believe this man would come back, so he knows there's more to the story. So he goes and, you know, investigates and finds this snake. Right? And this is why, of course, I think we have to say Ein Mazal Yisrael is not totally an anti-astrological. If I wanted to tell a story that outright rejected astrology, I could just have no snake at all. You know, tell the story, the man goes to the fields and comes back, and that's the end of it. Shmuel says, see, I told you so, and that's it. But this story, right, believes in astrology. It's just Shmuel knows there's more to impacting someone's destiny than astrology alone. Okay, so now I'm in section hey there, you can say Amar le Shmuel, ma avadet. So Shmuel says to this man, what did you do? And again, I like this story. We don't have to go into all the narrative aspects of it, but you know, basically you have a sort of flashback here. In other words, the story's use of time is kind of sophisticated. It doesn't tell us in the linear order because it doesn't tell us what the man did at the time he did it. He's already come back having done it, and now he repeats it to Shmuel, what he did earlier in the day. So, you know, again, if you're interested in these kind of narrative things like I am, that's, you know, that's a kind of interesting feature of this story. If you're not interested, then you're not interested. That's fine too. So Shmuel says, what did you do? Amar le kol yoma havina marminan rifta bahare hadade ve'achlinan. So every day we throw the bread together and we eat, or we collect the bread together and we eat. In other words, how did they have lunch? Let's imagine there were, you know, a dozen workers. What did they do?
Potluck.
Exactly. What we would call potluck. They all pooled their food and they shared it. This is a very nice way of making solidarity. Maybe someone went around with a basket, Rashi says, or one of the commentaries says, and collected everything. You can imagine him collecting it all and then putting it in the middle or whatever. So this one day, there was one of us who didn't have any bread with him, right? He didn't bring any food, either because he forgot it, or I would assume because he's poor, right? And he didn't have anything to eat, quite literally. So he wasn't able to contribute. V'hava machsiv. So, and he was embarrassed, right? Why was he embarrassed? Because he was going to be a freeloader, right? He was not going to be contributing. Amina lechavrai ana kaemna umarmina le rifta. So I said to my colleagues, I will get up and I will literally throw the bread, that is, collect the bread. Ki matai legabe, when I arrived at him. So again, you imagine this guy going from one to the other, collecting the bread. When I arrived at him, shavai nafshai keman deshakle mine ki hekli delo lichsiv. I made myself, in other words, I pretended like I was taking from him in order that he not be embarrassed. Okay, so he went around collecting the food. When he got to this guy, he pretended this guy had put it in, so he wasn't embarrassed. So now Shmuel says to him, Amar le mitzvah ka avadet ve'itzalt, you did a mitzvah and you were saved. Nafak Shmuel v'darash, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, famous verse. Tzedakah went out and taught Tzedakah saves from death. Tzedakah, of course, in rabbinic Hebrew and our Hebrew tends to mean charity, but in biblical Hebrew, it doesn't usually mean charity. It usually means righteousness. So righteousness saves from death. Velo mimita mishuna ella afilu mimita atzma. Not only from an unusual death, but from death itself. Now, this last conclusion is a little difficult. It doesn't read that well. Not only from an unusual or unnatural death, that's like death by a snake bite, that's any kind of early death. So tzedakah, righteousness would save you from that kind of death, like from this man, but even from death itself. Now, what does that mean? Clearly, everybody dies. Tzedakah is not going to save you from dying. So you have to take this to mean, even this would save you from your natural death and give you bonus time. So, if you were going to live to 80 and you did tzedakah, you might get 90. Okay, it saved you from your designated death in that way. Not that you would never die. Okay, so this is story number one. Everybody get the basic flow of the story? I mean, any basic questions? There is one major gap in this question, in this story. Okay, does anybody see the narrative gap? By narrative gap, I mean something you have to fill in. I mean, all literature has gaps. That's part of the pleasure of reading literature. The narrator or the storyteller, author doesn't tell you everything. But here there is a very large gap. Yes, Phil. Is that Phil?
In my chavruta, we brought up the fact that it's left open the exact sequence of events between his doing of the mitzvah and the snake, especially considering the snake is explicitly said to be cut into two pieces.
Okay, excellent, Phil. For you and your chavruta, okay, 100%. How did the snake get cut, right? What was the sequence of events? So how did you fill that in, Phil?
We didn't try too hard. I think we posited, or one could posit some sort of very active Old Testament style God coming down and cutting the snake. But
okay, so you want to say there was a whole miraculous event where suddenly divine intervention sent a lightning bolt and zapped the snake. Okay, maybe most rabbinic stories do not have that kind of biblical intervention. Although God does work, it's often behind the scenes. Anybody else fill that gap in a different way? How did the snake get cut? Okay, so one piece of information we know is that they were going to the marsh, the agma. Agma is either a marsh where you cut flax or sometimes just uncultivated land that has to be cleared for farming. So they presumably have a scythe or a sickle or maybe an axe with them because they're going to be cutting down stuff. Now, does that help close the gap at all? Yeah, was there another hand? Shira, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think we kind of just assumed that, like, oh, he's going to work, he must have some tools, so he saw a snake and like hacked it pieces.
Well, I don't think we could say that, because had he hacked the snake deliberately and intentionally, that would have been in his recounting to Shmuel, and I saw, because he says, "What did you do this day?" That's a pretty significant event. It seems like this man doesn't even know about the snake. Yeah, Bria Kahana.
Yeah, it seems like he was just cutting the stalks and then put the bundles in the bag, and then, oh, lo and behold, there's a snake that's cut in two, because as he was cutting, like, there was a snake that was there.
Oh, okay. So the snake was with the stuff he was cutting.
Yeah, it was in the marshes.
In the marshes, and he happened to cut it and throw it in with the wood that he bundled up. Okay, that's possible. Yeah, I think we have to say something like that. I thought of it a little differently, that the snake had snuck into his bundle or his bag and was, when he put it down. So let's say they came back from lunch. They came back to, they were going to have lunch. So they take a break. He puts down his pack and a snake crawled in there. And it was going to bite him, except, here's your divine intervention, Phil, except it's behind the scenes. When he withdrew his axe or his scythe or his sickle to go back to work, it happened to slice this snake into two pieces. Or you could say the snake crawled in, when he put it down in the morning, and when he was cutting down the wood, and then when he put it back in for lunch, it cut this snake. I think we would have to say at some point the snake had crawled into his bag, and he inadvertently cut it with his cutting implement when he put it, replaced it to his bag or took it out. The reason I like to think that it happened after lunch, while they were taking lunch, is then there's a kind of midah keneged midah. Right after he does this good deed, he happens to slice the snake as he then replaces his knife. Maybe he even cut some bread in half, or as he took it out again when he's going back to work. But, one way or the other, I think we have to fill in that gap, which is a large gap. I think we can fill it in, but, it does require some work. Yeah, Shira, Yeah, we're not hearing you.
Yeah, okay. I think it would be a little odd if like someone finds a dead snake in your bag and they say like, what happened? And you were to say, I killed it. That just seems like that would be the obvious, like that's kind of implied. It seems like the ma'avadita is like what, it doesn't seem like, even if ma'avadita is like the words that the Gemara is recording, it just doesn't seem like the real question was like, what did you do? How did this snake end up dead? Like it seems that the question that he's asking him, even also just based off of like the next two stories, like just doesn't seem to be like what happened, how did the snake get here?
Well, he's asking him what he did all day, and the man doesn't mention anything about the snake. That's why I think I have to assume it's inadvertent. But hold that while we do get to the other stories, because you're right. I think we'll see in the other stories it's also not deliberate. It's also unintentional, which kind of magnifies the fact that there must have been some, divine working behind the scene, or that the mitzvah had the effect, not the man himself. Okay, but you're right. There is a gap here. There is a gap. Yeah, Sophia.
In light of you saying that it was midah keneged midah, isn't it not just that like he did a mitzvah and therefore he was saved, but also that like he took a piece of bread and like made it into two, just as he does with like the snake gets split, and also like he puts in his bread and also an extra bit of bread for the other person. So literally that splitting of the bread for two people is like literally symbolizes life or death.
It could be. I mean, that's a good point. We don't have explicitly that he cut bread in two, he collected bread and they distributed it. It might be. I mean, you might want to fill in the gap that way. For me, that's filling in a bit too much. But I will say that the reason why there is a narrative gap and the story doesn't read that well is this story actually is a revision of a story that appears in the Yerushalmi. And in the Yerushalmi, they explicitly do cut a loaf into two pieces. So there, I think the symbolism works more. The loaf is cut in two, the snake is cut in two, much more midah keneged midah. The Bavli seems to have changed this for reasons, again, we can't get into here. If we had another hour, maybe. But let's just say, so because I want to move on. What is the mitzvah that this guy did?
He saved the guy from shame.
Good. Saved the guy from shame, right? This is preventing embarrassment, preserving someone's dignity. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. I mean, it's obvious, but just to
The rabbis equate it to murder, to let someone.
Right. So we know embarrassment is like causing your face to go white, and therefore like murder, right? Like shvichut damim. So there is a nice midah keneged midah if you take that a little literally, right? He saved this guy's life. His life was saved, maybe. Yeah, Dvir.
It's true that like reading it at face value, astrological fatalism isn't rejected because the rabbis do give it credence. But I think there is room to posit that like what they're doing is polemically much stronger, because what they're saying is that this thing that many people believe in can be trumped and can kind of be subdued by our system, that this system means absolutely nothing in the face of the mitzvah system, and even more so, the mitzvah system has powers that it isn't able to foresee, that it's able to like enter into your mavet etzem, that it's like it doesn't just predict your death, but it can actually extend life.
Yeah, you're right. Again, you are sort of translating the story into a more abstract formulation, which is exactly what I want us to do at the end. Exactly how it's translated is tricky. I mean, you could put it that way. I still think it would be stronger. It would, if there was no snake at all, if you just said astrology is totally false. Here the rabbis are saying, yeah, astrology works, but you're right, the mitzvot can blow it away, can overcome it, can supersede it, can extend your death, but they're still recognizing it. So to me, that's not as strong a rejection. It's a type of negotiation or trying to, recognize it, but express certain limitations. Hold on to both at once. That's not so easy. It's not so easy for us today. In modern orthodoxy tries to hold on to Torah Amada, and it's not always that easy. Is it evolution? Is it not evolution? Is it medical science? Is it prayer? I mean, I think of this every week when we're saying on Shabbat or whenever we're saying the prayer for the sick and Rofei Cholim and all that, and in the hospital, Anyway, but so again, larger question to get to. Sorry, I digressed for a minute. Okay, let's get to the second story because our time is limited. So second story, Umid Rabbi Akiba Nami Ein Mazal Yisrael. So from Rabbi Akiba, we also learn there is no mazal for Jews, or astrology is not the sum total of the story. De Rabbi Akiba Havule Barta, he had a daughter, Amrule Kaldai, the Chaldeans. Here is your question. The astrologer said to them, Hahuyama de Ayla Lebe Ganana Tarik Lachivya Umeta. That day when she enters the wedding canopy, a snake will bite her and she will die. Hava da'egala de milta tuva. So Rabbi Akiba worried about this a lot. Interesting. That's his reaction. Worried about it a lot. Hahu yoma da'ayla shakla lemachbanta. So on that day, or on that eve, probably, the night before she was going to enter the wedding canopy, right? She took her wedding crown, a difficult word, only appears a couple times in the Talmud. Da'itzta babiza, she stuck it in a crack in the wall. Apparently they didn't have chests of drawers. This was to keep it safe, her tiara that she was going to wear the next day. So she puts it aside. Itramila ayla ba'aina de chivya. So it happened for her that it went into the eye of a snake. Letzafra ki kashakla le havakasarich viati chivya batra. So in the morning, when she took it out, the snake was adhering to it and coming afterward. Okay, so everybody got the visual. What happened? She sticks it in this crack in the wall. Happened to be a snake there. The wedding tiara probably has pins to connect to her hair. And this pin went into the eye of the snake and killed it. Amar le avu amay avadet. So her father, Rebbe Akiva, says to her, what did you do? Amar le befanya ata anya. So she said to him, in the evening, a poor man came, kara abava, he called at the door. That is, he was asking for charity, asking for alms. V'havo tride kula alma besuudata. So everybody else was busy with the festive meal, the wedding meal before the wedding. The next day, Veleka de Shame, and no one heard him. Kamit Ana, I got up, Shaklit, Ve'amri, I got up and I took, and I said, Hadin distana or ristana, again, a difficult word, this portion of food, Diyahavitu li havu nihale, that was given to me, I'm going to give to him. So she was given a portion of the wedding banquet, part of the meal, and she took it, and she said, I'm going to give it to him. And then we have the same ending as the previous story. Amar le mitzvah ka'avaret v'itzalt. Rabbi Akiva says, you did a mitzvah and you were saved. Nafak Rabbi Akiva v'darash, and he makes the same drasha. Tzedakah tatzil mimavet, and the same ending, not only from an unnatural death, but from death itself. Okay, so again, nice story. Snake in the wedding chamber, or a monster or a demon, is a very common folk motif. In world literature, it occurs in Jewish literature in the book of Tobit, if it is, well, semi-Jewish, in the Apocrypha, if you're familiar with that, where a monster or a demon or a snake attacks a bride on her wedding day. Obviously, the snake has all those kind of connotations, phallic connotations, Garden of Eden connotations, sexual connotations. So, there's a lot to unpack here from a Freudian or psychological point of view, although that's not our interest. But here too, Shira, you can see it was inadvertent. This is why I prefer to see the cutting in the first story is inadvertent. She happened to stick her wedding crown there to keep it safe till morning, and it happened to enter the eye of the snake, who otherwise would have killed her. So again, you can see there is something to astrology. The astrologers were kind of right. There was a snake that would have killed her, and yet she was saved, according to the story, because of the mitzvah. Okay, so any questions about this story? Here, I don't think we have quite the narrative gaps as in the past story.
I did have a question about one narrative gap. It seems like the narrative gap is when somebody asks the question, what did you do? The people instinctively know to answer with the thing they did that was the mitzvah.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't see that as a gap. I mean, that's just part of the sort of working of the story. You know, she doesn't tell him everything, you know. Yeah, and then I chatted with my bridesmaids, and then I had a snack, you know, and then...
More that they know instinctively, like, I was saved from this thing because I did a mitzvah. Like, that's
well, she... Yeah, well, she doesn't make that connection necessarily. She just tells him what she did. Likewise, in the first story, the man just tells him what he did. But right, the unusual thing was the mitzvah. That's the thing that was not a normal... That's an unusual thing. So
I feel like if I had just stabbed a snake in a crown and you said, what did you do? I would have said I stabbed a snake with my wedding crown. I wouldn't have said like, oh, last night this person showed up and I gave him alms. Like that just seems like that would not be my instinct given the situation.
Yeah, I think we have to understand. In other words, Rebbe Akiva, she sees, you know, in section Dalet already, the snake is being, you know, is connected, is killed by her wedding crown. She comes to her father. We have to fill in and says, oh, look what happened. You know, the snake was dead in this crazy way. And Rabbi Akiva at that point says, wow, you know, that's amazing. What did you do? You know, what happened the previous day to cause this? So I think that's already taken for granted when the narrator in section Dalet tells us that happened. And then when Rebbe Akiva says, what do you do in 5? And hey, we have to imagine she's kind of presented this to him.
It also seems to be common in the Gemara for one person to ask another, what great thing have you done to merit such?
Yeah, it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. That is, I mean, again, you know, we don't have thousands and thousands of stories, but there are definitely a number of stories where rabbis will say, what are your deeds? Ma'av Daihu, what are your great deeds? What are, you know, so I haven't looked, you know, for this exact phrase, but there are a bunch of stories where something like this happens, you know. There's one in Tanit with this, you know, the rabbis visit some man and he brings rain and they ask him, what are your deeds? You know, so yeah. Other questions. Yeah. Someone, I can see everybody's hand who hasn't asked. Anybody else? Dvir, you want to ask again? Yeah.
How do you resolve the tension though, just kind of like stepping back and saying, if the rabbis are giving credence to the idea of astrology, then how do we resolve the whole concept that like we call people who do avodah zara avdei kochavim, and like there's the narrative against that?
Yeah, it's definitely a tension there, isn't there? Well, they worship mazalot. We don't worship mazalot. So it's wrong to worship the mazalot, you know, to bow down to them and think they're gods or potencies, but that they have some sort of effect is okay, apparently, for the rabbis. Again, for them, you know, it's like us with science. You know, the laws of nature, no one is going to reject gravity, but we don't worship gravity. And I think you have to say it in a similar sense. They think Saturn and the moon and all these things, like everybody believed, had influence over fate in a way that they didn't understand, no more than Newton understood exactly how gravity worked until Einstein explained it, right? But we knew it worked, so they knew it worked, but they didn't want to worship it, so, you know. And I think that's the point, you know, you don't want to worship it. That's the mistake, even if you recognize its power. Okay, let's go to the third story because I do want to have time for discussion. So, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Nami Ein Mazal Yisrael. So from Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak's story, we also see there's no Mazal Yisrael. De Emei de Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Amru Le Kaldai Barich Brech, I guess we should pronounce it, Ganva Yehe. So the mother of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, the Chaldean astrologer, said to her, your son will be a thief. This is something no Jewish mother likes to say. Can all the Jewish mothers here likes to hear, right? All the Jewish mothers here attest to that. Maybe your son will be a doctor. Maybe your son will be a rabbi. Not your son will be a thief. Okay. But that's what she gets. Lo shavkate galoye reshe. So she would not allow him to uncover his head. Amrale, she said to him, Kase reshech ki hechi delehave alach emata dishmaya, ubae rachme. She said to him, cover your head in order that the fear of heaven be upon you, and ask for mercy, or and pray. Lo hava yada amai ka'amrale. So he didn't know why she told him this. So again, apparently she did not disclose the prophecy, or the not prophecy, the prediction to him. She just told him, always keep your head covered. By the way, this is one of our sources for wearing a kippah. As you know, they're not really great halachic sources for wearing a kippah, but one of them. So Yom Echad Hava Kagaris. So one day he was learning, he was studying, repeating traditions. V'yatev tute dikla. He was sitting under a date palm. Apparently this palm tree belonged to someone else. Nafal glima me'iloye reshe. His covering fell from his head. Dali Ene, he looked up he raised his eyes. Chaze ledikla, he saw the palm. Alme Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara took hold of him, overpowered him. Salek, he went up. Paske lekibura b'shene, he cut off a date cluster with his teeth, bit it off. Stole or misappropriated what wasn't his dates. Now, this story on the face of it seems to contradict, right? This is what you all, I hope, realized. The astrologist said your son would be a thief, and it looked like he did become a thief. But how can the story then say this proves Ein Mazal Yisrael? So again, the commentators explain this with their two answers. One is that they predicted he would be a chronic thief, we might say, an inveterate thief, someone who always stole, and actually that did not come true. There was just this one act of stealing. So in fact, Ein Mazal Yisrael, he didn't become a thief. Or we could say, a variation of that, his thievery was again overcome by his thievery was able to be prevented, and therefore Ein Mazal Yisrael, because as long as he kept his head covering, he was not a thief, and that was contradictory to what the astrologers thought. In any case, we have to explain it one of those ways, because the story is presented as evidence Ein Mazal Yisrael. So let's take it for that. They thought he would be a chronic thief, in and out of prison, juvenile delinquent, and that wasn't the case. He just stole this one time, so Ein Mazal Yisrael. Okay, great. Any questions then about any of these stories individually? Yeah, he could have been both a Rav and a thief. In fact, he was, because he became Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. And unfortunately, we do know some rabbis who became thieves. I guess there's not mutual exclusive there, but that's not what you want to hear. Your son will be the rabbi type thief. You'd rather just have the Gadol Hador rabbi type prediction. All right. So yes, any questions before we go to the next?
I had a question.
Who is that?
Neil.
Neil.
I had a question about the story beforehand.
Yeah.
It seems like the poor person comes to her at night while everyone is at the feast. But
Yeah.
wouldn't the wedding feast happen after the chuppah, as in after she killed the snake?
Yeah, it could have been both. Apparently there was maybe a Suda mitzvah after the wedding or at the wedding, but, all the guests must have assembled the night before. Just like if you're having a wedding today, you've got to put on a pre-wedding banquet for all your out-of-town guests. That seems to be what was going on.
Thanks.
Yeah. Adina, you had a question?
More a comment, so
Yeah.
maybe it's part of the discussion session, but this seems like a qualitatively different story from the other two, because the other two are sort of about someone's fate, like in a concrete way, like will they die or not, but this is about somebody's sort of manipulation of somebody's personality in a way. and the kind of ways in which and I think it's actually more complicated and ambiguous than the other two, because on the one hand, it seems to be saying that there is potentiality to sort of mitigate the effects of astrology on a person's Yetzer or whatever, but on the other hand, it's still lurking around the corner as soon as you kind of halt that process. And there's no sense that like the ongoing process of, you know, Torah study being a different kind of person had any real impact on his sort of, you know, thieving capacities. And so I think it's actually a pretty challenging story in terms of, you know, how we understand like free will in a rabbinic context.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's a great point. And I think that, you know, again, we could talk about an hour about everything you said because you're raising great issues. I want to focus on one thing, though, that I want everybody to listen to for our next part, you know, of what I wanted to accomplish here. And that is, you said it's not like the other stories in that it's not a fate, it's manipulation of personality. I don't think so. I think it is a fate, but you're 100% right. It's a different kind of fate. In the first two stories, what was the kind of fate? Right, there was a prediction they would die. In this story, it's not a prediction of death, it's a prediction of a career, but it is a bad career. I mean, a thief, right? Or at least a sort of kind of profession. So it's not exactly personality. For them, it is almost an occupation. You know, thieving is your occupation. You're a highwayman, you're a thief. But what you're focusing on is 100% correct, and I want everybody to keep that in mind. Differences and contrasts between the stories, and you focused on an excellent contrast. This is a different kind of astrology. It's not the kind of you're going to die at this date, whether it's today, right, or at the chuppah. This is going to be your fate in terms of, you know, what you're going to turn out to be. Okay, so again, and if you look at astrology manuals from antiquity, they're chock full of that. What kind of you know, what your profession is going to be is one thing that astrologers will predict, you know. Okay.
We had raised hands from Deco and Aryeh, which I think comes to me and not to you, but I just want to go to them next.
Okay. Deco, yeah.
Great, thanks. I wanted to point out something I noticed that's also different between story 2 and story 3.
Yeah.
Both of them have a parent receiving a prediction about a child and very different reactions. And as you pointed out, Akiva's reaction was to be worried about it, but to do nothing. And like Devere was saying earlier, it's like, well, he must have believed in like a little bit to be so worried about it, but not enough to like act on it. And in fact, when the parent chose to act on it, look what happened, right? Sure, he didn't become a thief, but that sentence that was like, I think really key in the story that was like, and he didn't know why she told him to do this. Yeah. It's kind of like he didn't know why he was wearing the kippah. He didn't know why he was covering his head. Like he was doing something, but for like the wrong reason. And so then as soon as that fell off his head, it was like, oh, look, let me go steal those dates. Like, so it really had to come from the agency had to come from the individual for like the fuller effect of countering the prediction.
Okay, phenomenal. So just that's a great insight. Now, two things. Why she didn't tell him, again, is a question we could take up. I don't want to focus on it. You might say she didn't want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, or she didn't want it to worry him his whole life. If you tell your kid, you know, this is going to happen, they stress about it. But the other thing you mentioned is great. And actually, Michael, everybody's anticipating the third section of my study. So I'm going to go to that, and then we'll take all the other questions. But what Deco points out is a contrast between the two stories. The reaction of the parent, Rabbi Akiva's reaction is to worry about it, but apparently not do anything. Her reaction is what? To try to avoid it. She says, here's this fate, I'm going to prevent it. And she says, wear this kippah and pray to try to prevent. Now, let me also expand it. What is Shmuel's reaction in the first story?
He knows that he's going to come back, but he doesn't talk to the man himself.
Yeah, but Shmuel rejects it, right? There's the fate. Shmuel rejects it. Rabbi Akiva worries about it a little bit, but doesn't do anything. And in the third story, the mother tries to prevent it. So we have a contrast between the stories in terms of reactions. And you know, they're all in section bet. The stories actually have a very, very set structure, if you know, again, in terms of the different parts of it. And you can see the repetition in section 6 of or Vav of stories 1 and 2. So these are very, very well worked out, and the common structure is to try to invite us to do comparisons and contrasts. So since we don't have much time, I want everybody to take 3 minutes or by themselves, and I want you to do look at all 3 stories and try to find connections, which could be repeated language or use of the same motif, repetitions, and then contrasts. So a couple of the contrasts we've already mentioned are the reaction to the astrologer's prediction, rejection, worry, or try to avoid it. And we also mentioned a contrast Adina did in terms of the type of astrology, prediction of death, as opposed to negative kind of career. And actually, we could say there is a variation in the prediction of death. Although it's the same language, a snake will bite him or her and she will die. One type is death on that day, and the other is death on a day in the future. So you really have 3 different types of astrology. And again, there are technical terms in astrological literature for these kinds of astrology. Astrology that happens that day, astrology that happens at a set point in the future, and then kind of your career. So those are some, what I'm looking for: connections, variations, comparisons, contrasts, okay? We're gonna take 3 minutes and then we're all gonna share what we found, okay? All right, so anybody want to share a connection, repetition, or a contrast or something like that? Yeah. Yeah, Dvir.
Yeah, I like kind of, there's the snake motif that comes up. And then if like thinking about the Garden of Eden and everything, in the 3rd story, you can see him becoming like the representation of evil. And like his mouth grabs onto the like that.
Like a fruit, yeah.
Like a fruit. And then also, like in the 2nd story, everyone's immersed, that they're not like able to see outside of themselves, and they miss the opportunity for the mitzvah. But then like that, in contrast to the 3rd story, it's like the insular nature of the mitzvahs themselves prevent him from looking outside of himself, and that protects him from becoming that representation of evil.
Okay, very nice. All right, yes. So there's clearly a very marked repetition in stories 1 and 2 in the nature of the prediction. A snake will bite him and he will die, right? So, which evokes the Garden of Eden. And yeah, so that's not the prediction in the 3rd story, because like we said, the prediction in the 3rd story is not about death. So it couldn't have been a snake biting him and he would die. But there is a little bit of that, yes, Garden of Eden imagery. So there's a nice kind of connection there, right? So good, very nice. All right, anyone else? Comparison, contrast, yes, Maxime. Maxime.
Yeah, so it's interesting the way food and death sort of plays out here. So in the first 2 stories, we have people who a poor person probably needs food to live, and the food in the first one is less clear, but we have this idea of like there's the sandwiches and then there's the snake that's going to actually kill you. So food, death. Whereas in the 3rd story, we have food and like Yetzer Hara. So like he's not, and also thievery as opposed to death. Right, so like the food is still contrasted with a negative outcome, but I think like because the negative outcome is just becoming a thief, then therefore also the like Yetzer Hara, the like need for food is less, just desire as opposed to needing it to live.
Okay, great. So there is a common theme in that all stories involve food. Great. And it's very close in the first 2 stories, as you point out. Both involve a poor person and food, but the mitzvah actually works in almost opposite ways in stories 1 and 2, because in story 1, it's not charity and it's not giving food. What does it involve? It's almost the opposite. It's pretending to take food from a poor person. And in story 2, it is actually giving food to a poor person. Both actually use the word shakli. I took in recounting that. So it's food with a poor person in opposite ways. And while you mention that, let's again sort of flesh that out. We sort of said this, but what is the mitzvah in each of the stories? You allude to this. What is the good deed that saves? In the first story, we said it was preventing embarrassment. In the second story, it's charity. And in the third story, it's?
Attempting to save someone from becoming a sinner. That doesn't work.
Well, that's the mother's good deed. What's the son's good deed?
Covering his head.
Yeah, apparently covering his head.
But he's also learning when this happens.
Yeah, okay, learning, right? Learning and keeping his head covered.
But the learning isn't what stops him.
Yeah, it's keeping the head covered. But so assuming that's a mitzvah or some sort of example of piety, again, maybe not a mitzvah in a technical sense of commandment, but, in some act of piety, how would we contrast the mitzvot in the stories? What category do they fall into? Ben Adam leMakom or Chavero? Right, the first two are Ben Adam leChavero, and the last one would be a kind of Ben Adam leMakom, I think, in that sense. Good. Other comparisons, contrasts, variations.
Phil had his hand.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a progression in the responses to the prediction, right? In story one, Amar le Shmuel Azil va'ate. So Shmuel rejects the privileged knowledge. Story two, Ha'udaig Allah. So Rabbi Akiva accepts the privileged knowledge but doesn't do anything about it. And then story four, the mother lo shavakte galui resha. The mother accepts the privileged knowledge and she acts to counteract the privileged knowledge. So it seems like there's I would see that as a progression in terms of the character's attitudes towards.
Okay, I don't know what you mean by progression. There is a difference. I don't know if these stories are leading to a end as much as just inviting us to compare and contrast. So yeah, you could say there is a progression in those kind of, depending on how you define it. But certainly you articulate the differences excellent. That's for sure.
Like, yeah. I guess I would say the progression is towards accidentally doing mitzvot to proactively doing mitzvot.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's an interesting theme, right? In the story, in the first two stories, they deliberately do the mitzvah, but the snake that was going to bite them is killed inadvertently, correct? In the third story, he deliberately keeps his head covered, but it is through an inadvertent uncovering of the head that he ends up doing the bad deed. So there is a kind of play in each story about deliberate or inadvertent, in terms of what transpires. But certainly in the third story, as long as he is deliberately keeping his head covered, let's say, the mitzvah is, the bad fate is prevented, which I think does contrast with maybe a little bit with the other stories. Sophia, yeah.
Although I understand that it's deliberate, isn't it also in a way not deliberate in a final story? Because he doesn't know why his mother's telling him any of this.
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't know the reason behind it, but he must be, keeping it on his head each morning.
Right, but for the other two, it's clear that they're doing tzedakah because they want to help the other person. But here, he's doing a mitzvah without really understanding why, which might be part of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So I guess we could say that's a good well, he knows it's a mitzvah. He just doesn't know the backstory of this fate that's hanging over his head. Right. All right, good. Other comparisons or contrasts? All right, let me ask you, what is the role of the rabbi in each story? First story.
He's almost an astrologer in the first story.
Yeah, he's an astrologer, but his relationship to the protagonist? To the man, the hero.
Is a random person.
Yeah, he's a bystander, right? What's Rabbi Akiva, this rabbi in the second story is Rabbi Akiva. What's his relationship to the protagonist?
He's the father.
Father. And the third story, the rabbi is?
He's the subject of the...
He is the subject. Okay, so we have rabbis in each story from, bystander to family member to protagonist himself. The second story we mentioned is Rabbi Akiva and a daughter, father and daughter. The third story is?
The mother and the son.
Mother and son. We have a nice comparison there. Okay, what about head coverings? Okay, in the second story,
it protects you from the bad mazel.
Yeah, taking off the head covering and sticking it in the wall actually saves the woman, the daughter. In the third story, taking off the head covering causes the prediction. Okay, so the head coverings work in opposite ways, like the food, taking the food from the poor person in the first two stories. Okay, I don't know if we mentioned this, but the astrologer in the first story is who? Is Avlat, this named guy. In the second two stories, the astrologers are
Chaldeans.
Yeah, just these Chaldai, these Chaldeans, but it repeats that language, Amrule Chaldai.
They're also plural, and the second one's singular, or the first one is singular.
Yeah.
It's a group of astrologers. And
Yeah, right, exactly. One astrologer versus a group. And the first two stories end the same way, with the rabbi going into the Beit Midrash and making this drasha, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, which gives it a kind of rabbinic flair. It connects it to scripture with the same teaching. That obviously you can't have that in the third story, because the prediction does not involve death. So you couldn't quote the verse mavet, because there is no mavet. Okay, it's a different type of prediction, like we said. There are a few other things, language in common. There are a few other connections, but I think you can see that there is a tremendous amount of what I call cohesiveness in the stories. That is repetition of language, repetition of theme, but with comparison and contrast, holds these stories together, and I think invites us to see them as a literary unit. That is the reason you have these connections between the first two stories, same prediction, a snake will kill him and he will die. Second and third story, right? Chaldean said to him. Second and third story, mother and son, father and daughter, right? All these connections is to make us look at these, invite us to look at them together. And then the comparison and contrast is to expand our perspective on astrology. This is what I was trying to say at the beginning, that the rabbis are trying to look at astrology in a more general or abstract or philosophical way, but not using philosophical language. And what I mean is this: if you only had the first story, let's say that's all the rabbis gave you, what might you have thought? Well, you might have said Ein Mazal Yisrael. Of course, that's what the story says. But you might have said, well, the kind of astrological prediction that can be overcome by astrology is one that has to do with death on that day. What about death on your wedding day far in the future? What about a prediction about a career? Maybe that kind of astrological determinism can't be superseded by fate. I don't know, because I only have this one story. Likewise, if I only had, say, the third story, I might say it's only the rabbis who could avoid an astrological prediction. What about a regular man? I don't know. What about a woman? I don't know, right? Maybe the rabbis have some special quality. If you only had the first two stories, you might say it's only predictions about death that can be superseded, not predictions about, your career. If you only had the second story, you might say it's only charity as a mitzvah that could prevent a bad astrological fate. Or if you had the first two, you might say it's only mitzvot ben adam lechaveiro that could prevent an astrological fate. What about mitzvot ben adam lemakom? Again, who knows, right? So what the stories do as a whole, grouped together, is to make these, the engagement with astrology in a much more nuanced, general, and almost abstract way. If I were writing this in a philosophical manner, I would say there are three types of astrology, and all can be superseded by doing mitzvot. Astrology about predictions on a given day of death far in the future and of a career. Astrology affects men, women, and children, but all of these can be overcome. By the way, we should have mentioned that. It's a man, a woman, her daughter, she's getting married, and then a child, maybe a son and a daughter. Well, it's not clear how old they are, but you might have said astrology that affects adults, like the man in the first story, can be overcome, maybe not younger people in the second and third, right? I would write an essay on astrology in a philosophical way to try to express the rabbinic view of astrology, how I could overcome astrology or the limits of astrology, right? The effects of mitzvot on astrology. I would try to, write this in this kind of more general, abstract, and philosophical way. The rabbis are not doing that, but I feel that's what they're trying to do. And they do it through this very, very careful variation of elements so that you get a larger perspective and you answer all those questions, while at the same time drawing connections between the stories to add to the cohesiveness and make us see it as a unit. And in general, this is what I feel, I think story cycles do. There's story cycles on all sorts of things. Very famous one that Ruth Calderon and everybody talks about in Ketub Bot, about rabbis who go away, leave their wives to study. And again, there's 6 or 7 stories there, including the famous one of Rabbi Akiva and his wife. And they also have a lot in common, but vary the elements for the purpose of comparison and contrast to give you a wider perspective on that issue. So it's a narrative, it's a way of addressing larger issues, through narrative. Anyway, so that's my spiel. So Michael, if there are any, I don't know how much time, there are questions, reactions, comments, I'm happy to stay, as long as you want.
I would say let's take 1 or 2, and then we're gonna take a break before half an hour Shabbat.
Okay, sure. You want to call on people for me?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Just keep your hand up for a second, especially if okay. Let's get Gabby and then Aryeh.
Okay. I just wanted to know what you think the symbolism of the snake is.
Well, the snake, I think it's like the snake in all rabbinic literature. It's sin. It's the Yetzer Hara. It's Satan. So, here it's just a symbol of death and evil, going back to the Garden of Eden. I don't think there's anything special there. Again, in the second story, there might be a little bit of this, this common folk motif of the snake or the monster on the wedding day that seems to have some, sexual connotations too. But in the first story, it's just evil, death.
Thank you.
Okay, and Aryeh?
Yeah, thank you. So this might be going back a little bit, but I think there's like another difference between the third story and the first 2.
Yeah.
So one way to think about this is that the third story kind of reminds me of, like, I think it's another Gemara in Shabbos. I think it's actually around here, where it talks about that based on like the months of the signs that everyone has personality traits. So the Gemara says, well, you could either, let's say, if it's blood, then it could either be you're going to murder someone, or you're going to be let's say a shochet or something.
Yeah.
So it seems like the third story is kind of going into that a little bit, where it could be that that's more of a prediction about, like, similar to those predictions that, slang you're gonna be this type of person, and so therefore him doing it, it's not like a pure binary option of whether or not the mazal is fulfilled.
Well, actually, the sugya you're referring to, correct. It does appear just above this in the section of the sugya that actually deals with Yesh Mazal Yisrael, and it says if you're born under Mars or Ma'adim, which is blood, you'll be a shochet or a murderer or so on. If you're born under this planet, you'll be this. So again, this is picking up on this very common type of astrology, which the rabbis even pick up on, which is that it does determine your profession. So I think this is really, standard astrological stuff. Yeah.
All right. Dr. Rubenstein, thank you so much. This has been really, really wonderful.
Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Shabbat
you
Shalom.
so much.
Thank you so much.
It's really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.